My name is Steve Edwards. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Politics, and we are pleased to have all of you with us tonight for our conversation with BuzzFeed Editor-in-Chief Ben Smith and Shayla Murray, longtime journalist in her own right, most recently Senior Advisor to former President Barack Obama and current IOP Spring Fellow. We'll have formal introductions of the two of them in just a second, but I wanted to quickly thank the folks at International House for hosting us once again as part of their Global Voices series. We're always delighted to be in this room and working with them. I also wanted to highlight a few upcoming events for you to mark on your own calendars. As many of you know, the mission of the IOP is to cultivate the next generation of public service and political leaders, and our speaker series is an attempt to really elevate and expand the public conversation through a series of forums and dialogues just like this one. Tomorrow night, former U.S. Homeland Security Advisor to President Obama, Lisa Monaco, and CNN's Chief National Security Correspondent, Jim Sciutto, will explore the greatest challenges facing the United States and how the Trump administration is planning to manage them. That will be tomorrow night at 5:15. And then on Thursday, we'll be back again, welcoming a group of lawyers who formerly worked in a variety of cabinet agencies and federal government, including the Department of Homeland Security, the State Department, and the Department of Transportation. And I want to underscore this conversation because it's a rather unique one, looking at the role that lawyers play in the regulatory and legal environment in government, specifically federal government, something that we have been reading a lot more about in recent weeks and months, but not necessarily a new trend if we look at presidential administrations. So they're going to talk about legal limits of federal policy and how executive branch lawyers help develop, prove, and implement such policies. You can find out more about all three of those events and their locations on our website at politics.uchicago.edu. A quick housekeeping note, we will open up the floor to questions from the audience as we go through the conversation tonight. We'll put a microphone here in the center and ask that you line up to pose your questions. Because we are a student-focused institute, we reserve the first 3 questions for students, but we invite all of you to line up thereafter and pose questions that you have. We just simply ask that when you do, that you keep your questions short and to the point so that we can get to as many of you as possible. So now is a good time to make sure your phones are on silent. And it's also a good time for me to exit the podium and introduce Maddie Anderson, who's a third-year public policy major in the college, to formally get our program started tonight. Maddie is also our multimedia intern at the IOP. Please put your hands together and welcome Maddie Anderson. Maddie?
It is my great honor to introduce Ben Smith, Editor-in-Chief of BuzzFeed. Ben Smith was born and raised in New York City. His first professional reporting job was doing the crime beat for the Indianapolis Star. He then moved to Latvia to take a position at the Baltic Times and also began reporting for the Wall Street Journal Europe. When he returned to New York City, Mr. Smith wrote for the New York Sun, the New York Observer, and the New York Daily News. Additionally, between 2004 and 2006, Mr. Smith started 3 of the leading New York City political blogs, The Politiker, The Daily Politics, and Room 8. In 2007, Mr. Smith began reporting for Politico and became one of its prominent writers and bloggers. That is, until December 2011, when Mr. Smith shocked us all when he left Politico to become the editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed. Since taking his post at BuzzFeed, Mr. Smith has brought political reporting to the website without betraying its signature lighthearted attitude. He uses his Washington connections to help BuzzFeed raise its profile among the politics and punditry crowd. Today, Mr. Smith is joining Spring 2017 IOP Fellow Shayla Murray. Ms. Murray previously served as Senior Advisor to President Obama, as well as Chief of Staff and Communications Director to Vice President Joe Biden. In her White House roles, Ms. Murray oversaw a long-term communications planning process and led efforts to vastly expand engagement opportunities for the President and Vice President to include social media products, documentaries, podcasts, book reviews, and academic journals. Prior to joining the White House, Ms. Murray worked as a foreign correspondent, congressional correspondent, and a national political reporter for the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. Today, Ms. Murray and Mr. Smith will discuss the role of new media in politics, the relationship of the press corps to the White House, and the power of 140 characters. Thank you to Mr. Smith and Ms. Murray so much for being here, and thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you.
So Ben and I are sitting here 8 years ago. We were also sitting together on a campaign plane. We were both covering the Obama campaign. And I was kind of horrified that there was a blogger on the airplane, and saw that as like an ominous sign that we would all be bloggers by the time that campaign was over. And we were.
You were nicer to me than some.
Yes. So, you know, it's interesting to look back in that period. It was very recently, as the crow flies. We had, you know, the way it worked then is we would get off the plane, we would come out of an event, we would file a little vignette, and we would just move on to the next event, instead of storing it up the way we had just 4 years earlier when I covered the Kerry campaign. There were days you'd go by without writing a story at all. So the momentum really picked up. I thought there was a lot of value in that. I thought it brought people closer into the process. And the little stuff actually did matter as much as the big stuff. I guess the difference then was that at the end of the day, we'd still write the big story for the newspaper the next day. And you know, now we're living in this era where you know, it's just, sometimes it's just a tweet and the moment goes by. So but I'd be interested in, I switched sides a long time ago. I'd be interested in your thoughts on how coverage has evolved between 8 years ago and this last campaign, what it was like managing that coverage.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, what you're talking about was essentially this moment when, I mean, I came up writing for newspapers, the New York Daily News, the Journal. Maddie did very good research. There's a couple on there I don't put on my resume. The New York Observer and others, and not, I mean, they're on my resume, but the Baltic Times, less so. You know, and when you work in a newspaper, you know, your job is to produce newspaper articles. They have like you know, they're this long, and they're in the reverse pyramid structure, and it's sort of a sentence that summarizes the story, and then a sentence with a bit more context, and then a sentence of just sort of speculative bullshit, and then a quote that restates the previous sentence. I mean, there's this very clear form, and you're filling it. And it's not particularly about the reader. You're not thinking, what is this person, who is this person I'm talking to, and what are they interested in? You're thinking, this is how you write a newspaper article. You assemble it, you put it in the newspaper. It's a pretty good form. It's not useless. It's just, that's how you think about it. And I think, and what you were dealing with, I think, which is like no fun, was this moment when newspapers are a medium where you have a space for that shaped widget, and you are required to make that shaped widget. Meanwhile, most of the audience, or a lot of audience, or a huge audience, is living somewhere totally different. They want information in a kind of different form. They don't need as much context because it's surrounded by context. Mm-hmm. They're on the web. If they don't know who Senator Schumer is, you don't have to say, comma, Democrat from New York, because they can Google him. And a lot of the readers of politics are junkies who are, and particularly in a big presidential campaign, you know, millions of people are very, very focused on it, and they know who David Axelrod is. They don't need an introduction, and so you can, in a way, be more incremental and update, just sort of, here's what happened, here's what just happened, assuming that you're writing in a way for the highest common denominator, for somebody who's pretty sophisticated about the subject and doesn't need that much context. And so I think it was particularly no fun to be a newspaper reporter in that moment when you were basically expected to do both.
Right.
And competing with people like me who were just doing one thing and doing this sort of incremental thing, and then occasionally, when it was useful, stepping back and writing a big story, but without really much of a print publication to fill, a sense of, we need, we got 18 column inches over here, somebody's got to make something to stick in them. Yeah, so I think that was, and we were, I think, thinking very much, what are people interested in? What do people want to know about this event? Not how do I create a product of a certain shape and size to put into a larger bundle.
Do you think reporters erred too much to the other extreme this year, or is that just their perception?
I guess I think that change. I mean, the thing that it turned out, the thing that in this particular moment, that nobody really seems to want on the internet is a newspaper article that is a pretty good summary of what happened yesterday. Mm-hmm. Because if you're following things very, very closely, you know what happened today. You don't need to read about it tomorrow. And if you're not really following closely, what you want is not a summary of what happened yesterday. You want a story about something really important and meaningful, not just here's what happened yesterday. And so and so there's this, and so I think what we found and what we focus on is, that there's sort of these two things that people are interested in: a very quick, clear, or funny, or focused update on what is happening right now, and then on the other hand, a really big scoop or a really big feature. We published a story today that I think the reporter is working for more than a year on a cop in Chicago who's allegedly framed 51 people for murder, or for crimes, which is crazy, but not an easy story to report. It takes forever. And that's a story that'll cut through because of its sort of weight. And the thing that a lot of us spent a lot of our careers working on, which was sort of something in the middle, here's just sort of a recitation of what happened, of some facts that happened yesterday, I think is less in demand.
Although most of the campaign reporting that I did was going out into the field by myself, interviewing people, like trying to discover things before I heard about them from the candidate necessarily, or
Yeah, and I think those are still stories. A story that tells you something new
right.
is a story people will read and share. A story that tells you something that has already been out there is probably not.
Although one does wonder how the country was so surprised by the outcome of the election if they weren't consuming a lot of that.
Although
content.
it was not for a shortage of stories about angry white people in the upper Midwest going to Donald Trump events. Like that was the single, it's sort of a myth of this campaign that nobody wrote about upset people who support Donald Trump. Like that was definitely the most written story of the campaign.
So let's talk about Donald Trump. You grew up with Donald Trump. You've probably known
He's
about
my dad.
him your whole life, right? We all feel that
little
way now.
known fact.
What is it about this moment in the media that seems so perfectly matched to his skill set?
So I do think that to understand him, he came up in the New York tabloid media of the 1980s and was deeply, and has been exactly like this ever since. And he's not, and to some degree he is perfect for this moment, but not because he is he's been thinking about social media for a long time, but because, he sort of has this very instinctive style and this very detailed sense of how sort of reporters work and publicity works, kind of shaped in that ecosystem. Two stories about that. So when I was a City Hall reporter in, I guess, 2002, and Maggie Haberman was sort of sat across from me, and I obviously learned everything I know about reporting from her. She was a reporter for the New York Post. I remember asking her, in the New York Post gossip pages, there would constantly be these revelations about his personal life, that he and, I think it must have been Marla Maples at that point, were or weren't sleeping in the same bed, or were or weren't having great sex, or whatever, always attributed to a source close to Donald Trump. And I would ask, who is this source you guys have? How do you get a source like that? That's crazy. Are you paying them? And it's like, no, that's code for Donald Trump. And that was a big revelation to me as a reporter, as a young reporter. And then when I got to the New York Observer in, I guess, 2003, by that time, we never wrote about Donald Trump. It was a paper that covered the New York power elite as it saw it, and he wasn't part of that world. He was kind of irrelevant, kind of a joke. In fact, there had at some point in the Observer, there was a ban on quoting him because he was so easy to get on the phone that it was like cheating.
Yeah, exactly.
To quote Donald Trump talking about whatever. So that's, and I guess I think more seriously now, he's obviously really obsessed with and focused on television. He's a real creature of television. The Apprentice made him. Before that, he's from New York, but he had this huge controversial development project that never got built on the Upper West Side. There's going to be called Television City. He's really and I think the thing that he figured out was at a moment of real weakness and decline of both broadcast and cable, which was 2015, 2016, that he had this, he could draw rating, they were not in a position to dictate terms to him. They were desperate for ratings and were really in trouble. And he was able to sort of syndicate the Donald Trump show to them. And they weren't really in a position to negotiate. Mm-hmm. And I think, in a way, when you think about his use of social media, it's really, he's using Twitter not to, you're not, he's not, he'll say, I have 100 trillion followers, but those numbers are obviously not the actual number of people who are directly seeing his tweets, but he's using it to program television. And again, I think this has changed a lot since the election or even the later campaign. But in primary season, television was largely people reading Donald Trump tweets aloud.
Right. So how much of that is strategic and how much of it is just spontaneous and instinctive on his part?
Yeah, I don't know him well, but it does seem like he sort of is who he is. And it seems like he just kind of has been doing the same thing for years and years. And strategic implies a level of pre-planning that you don't really seem to see a ton of evidence of.
So
Somebody asked me earlier today, if you had one question for Donald Trump, what would you ask him? And it's like, I don't even know. Like, it seems like we know what he thinks about most things.
I can think of a few questions.
What would you ask him?
Well, never mind. Okay, so let's talk about Hillary for a second. She got a lot of grief for having a digital staff of 200 people, which is roughly the size.
Wait, really?
Yes, she
It's
did.
like the size of my newsroom almost.
Right, so we had a digital staff of 200 people in 2012, and
Okay.
were heralded as tech savvy and
Yeah, you won
right
the
on top
internet.
of things. How would you size up her presence compared to Trump? And do you think that's, did she use those 200 people effectively? And do you think that was a factor at all in her ineffectiveness in reaching people?
I think the idea that there's something called like a digital strategy that is different from who you are as a public figure in the world doesn't really make sense. Like most media consumption is digital. I think I don't think her problems.
Or her social media, like self-generated stuff like Trump.
Right, but I guess I don't think her problems were fundamentally kind of tactical. It was like the person, she didn't appeal to people, and so there was something about her lack of a clear message about why she wanted to be president and why people should support her that I think across digital media and rallies and other forms of communication didn't quite hit. I do think, right, that there's something about Trump's sort of like the authenticity.
Right.
On social media that was compelling, and Clinton's the sense that every tweet had been written by committee that really kind of came through, probably didn't help her connect.
To what extent were you aware of this fake news phenomenon during the campaign, and how did you digest that internally as a news organization?
So I think we really, among other things, kind of coined the term fake news to have it immediately thrown back in our faces by the president. But I think the reason that we've been writing about this kind of broader media ecosystem for a long time, and I think it has to do in part with how we see our jobs, which is there's a convention, an appropriate convention, I think, in traditional media that if you don't touch false information, that if there's a false story going around, you don't, I guess the word is dignify it by touching it and debunking it. And I think if you're the New York Times, it would be crazy to have a story on your front page that said, here is a false rumor going around, don't believe it. Because your audience is basically getting their news from the New York Times, and why would you tell them about this? I think if you assume, as we do, and that your audience is really swimming in social media, seeing a lot of your stuff on social media, and living in this very noisy, chaotic, polluted media environment, then your role is in part to say, here, particularly in a breaking news situation, which, by the way, breaking news has always been a disaster in a newsroom. Like, something happens, a crime is committed, a bomb goes off, you have the wrong name of the suspect, you have the wrong address, you have all the wrong details, just like everybody else. But after 5 or 6 hours of reporting, you've kind of got it down, and then you go to press with something that looks reasonable and thought out. And now this is transparent to the public, and the public sees us all running around like idiots and says, you people are idiots, but we've always been idiots. But then the question in that kind of situation is, do you say, here's what we know, but we don't know a lot, or do you just wait and let your audience kind of see all sorts of crazy claims and stay silent until you really know what's happening? And I think our choice broadly has been to try to steer people through this complicated ecosystem and say, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, it's developing, here's a claim that has been made that you've probably seen, there's no way to verify it, here's where it's coming from. Just to try to help steer people through this very messy ecosystem. And so as a result, we were seeing people in these breaking news situations publish false stories that looked like real stories deliberately to get traffic, and one of the things I do think you can do aggressively is figure out who those people are and why they're doing it. And so we had published this reporter of ours, Craig Silverman, had published a series of stories about these kind of fake news barons. The most amazing one about these teenagers in Macedonia who were doing it because like the media, the kind of clickbait media business in the U.S. is not a great business. Like you make thousands of dollars, not hundreds of thousands of dollars, but thousands of dollars go a long way in Veles, Macedonia. And so these kids were buying musical instruments and cars, and it was like a pretty good living. And and as far as we could tell, that was the motive. It was kind of arbitraging American views for Macedonian, merchandise, and without a real clear political motive. But the stories that did the best for them were Hillary Clinton's about to be indicted, Hillary Clinton died, and is like Weekend at Bernie's, like whatever the story is, which they were mostly copying and pasting from fringe sites and kind of optimizing. But these were the most shared stories on Facebook in the fall of 2016.
They did a great survey right after the election about it. Craig did that, right?
Yeah.
So why do you think it surged so much right at the end? Do you think that was driven by the campaign, or do you think did you see any?
I mean, no, I think there were, I do think that demand was what drove it most. People wanted to be deluded or wanted these stories, and entrepreneurial weirdos rose up to supply them these kind of false stories. I think, right around now you're seeing some of that with the Russia story. There's a huge demand for a smoking gun that proves that Donald Trump was the mastermind with Vladimir Putin of a Russian conspiracy. And there are great stories around the campaigns tied to Russia. There's clearly a lot, Paul Manafort is in huge trouble. There's a lot of real news, but there's also a lot of Glenn Beck style chalkboards with lines and arrows and 2 degrees of separation, and maybe if this is true, this is true. And there's so much demand for that you see sort of entrepreneurs, some of them real hucksters, some of them true believers, sort of rising up to fill it.
No, it's fascinating. There's like whole news services that exist on Twitter now that are dedicated to surfacing that kind of information and trafficking in it. Yeah, it's really interesting. So do you think last year's campaign was like the dawn of a new age, or do you think it was an anomaly?
Ask me in 30 years? I don't know. That feels like above my pay grade.
Oh,
I think I don't know. I do think Trump was sort of a unique figure in a lot of ways, right? Like if he hadn't run, then somebody who was a normal politician would have wound up being, it's,
right.
It's hard to do the counterfactuals. And I also think it's easy to overinterpret a campaign that had a lot of complicated factors, including his losing the popular vote by a really wide margin.
Right. So shifting to President Trump, the moment we're in now, how did you change the way you cover the White House to adjust for some of these innovations that they've brought?
So we sort of get to cheat because we're a new organization. We have had a modest Washington presence, and honestly, like the last years of a president's term, as we started to ramp up, the White House ramped down and the national politics rise, and so we've only really fully staffed up our Washington operation, for the last several months, and I think we have a White House correspondent who goes to work there every day and talks to press staffers and sometimes gets answers and raises his hand at the Sean Spicer Fest and doesn't get called on, and all this sort of the ritual of it. I do think I've never been a big fan of access journalism, but the premise of access journalism, which is a legitimate premise, is that when you kind of get somebody to sit down and talk to you on camera, that they will tell you the truth ultimately, and if they don't, really, what's the point? And so in some ways the fact that access is to the administration right now is sort of worthless. It's kind of liberating for reporters to go do the reporting.
I know. So how do you? When everybody's leaking, how do you pressure test conflicting information? How do you figure out who to believe or handle that?
Senior White House staffers trashing each other is news. That is interesting, right? Whether, regardless of, in a way, the substance of it. I do think, we're all chasing, everybody is chasing these stories about these kind of complex factions inside the White House going after each other. I think that's, in some ways, that's not a new form of journalism.
No,
that's
not
just,
at all. It's just boring under us.
Particularly extreme.
Right. And how much, and so do you have someone who monitors Twitter all the time? I mean, do you have to do that in shifts, or how does that work exactly?
I mean, I think that it's sort of organic for my team. I've told the folks at Twitter that I think that, I mean, my staff basically works full-time for Twitter and occasionally publishes on BuzzFeed.
So is it the infighting stories that perform the best, or what, how does
You know,
that?
we haven't, I think some of those are great stories, and I think, the Times in particular and Maggie
Yeah,
and Glenn
right.
have just dominated those stories and done a great job. And we've published a few of them. We had a great story about Reince, sort of, I think those are interesting stories and it's important to keep track of them. But no, I think the stories that people are interested in when you can, are big explanatory stories. I think people, or stories that really reveal something new. I mean, I do think the basic question people are asking is just like, what the hell is going on? And the ultimate answer to that is not that there are like factional differences. It's that these sort of, and I think so. I mean, I don't know. But ultimately, I think we are trying to not primarily be reactive to Donald Trump's tweets, but more to be investing in original reporting, in exclusives, and like Ali Watkins had this amazing scoop yesterday about the Trump advisor Carter Page having genuinely met with real Russian spies and passed them documents in 2013. They were being recorded they were being recorded by the FBI. The best part of it, though, is that they thought he was an idiot, and the whole recorded conversation is, this guy is an idiot.
Yeah.
It is possible. I think this is often true of the media, maybe truer of the media, but it's easy to sometimes confuse incompetence and malice.
Actually, it's the most underappreciated.
Yeah, and I think often when people have conspiracies about us, it's like, no,
it's like, tell me how that came about. It's like, well,
it's like, no,
I
really
just
don't
did.
even want to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, when I was a reporter, I never wanted to cover the White House because I always felt like it was like a caged animal.
Oh, it's like a Stockholm syndrome.
Yeah, exactly. But it seems like now it's so entrepreneurial, and so you're just unrestrained by all these conventions.
I think this is the question of sort of what happens when the White House, when the president and his staff lose all credibility, is they lose a certain kind of leverage over the press,
Right.
which is, hey, be nice to us and we'll give you good information. You're not giving good information. I mean, that's like, there's always been a transactional thread in journalism, but like it, love it or hate it, and their inability to keep up the side of the transaction, which is providing true information, is has in some ways been pretty liberating.
But he does have really good relationships with a number of reporters. Like, I think Maggie, he still has a relationship with.
Trump does?
Yes, he'll just call these reporters out of the blue, and like he did
I think he knows
after
he
healthcare.
needs them. I'm not sure it's like a good. I think good is a compliment. Yeah, I think it's a. He has
Well, they're
relationships.
much more
He definitely has
fluid.
he has direct relationships.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I
Yeah,
guess to a
that's
journalist,
good.
that's good, right?
I'm not sure they're like warm.
But they're useful. Yeah.
Yeah.
So is there anyone in there you think who can like tell him not to tweet, or that he actually takes advice from on this stuff, or is that just no?
I mean, I think this idea that this guy, this 70, what is he, 72, 73-year-old man who's been like this, exactly like this,
His
in
whole life.
public, in private, but very much in public for like 40 years, was at some point just going to undergo this miraculous personality change. Seems not to have happened.
Yes, it's not a growth experience.
But also when people are saying, why did he tweet that? It's like, because he's mad at the TV. Like,
he's tweeting at the TV.
Yeah, like there's not another answer.
Yeah, right.
Like, what's the
like
strategy?
dealing
no,
with
no.
a teenager.
He says he's mad at this thing because he's mad. Like, there's not some.
Right.
There's no reason to think that there's some other answer.
So let's talk a little bit about social media writ large right now. To what extent do you think this whole new world that we're living in is reinforcing this polarization, or is responsible for it?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that polarization is so deep and, obviously has been growing, has been building for a long time. I mean, I think that cable news has played a huge role in it, and Fox has been, to some degree, MSNBC played over decades played a big role. I think, the increasing ability to sort of, that kind of information is tribalizing,
right.
and that you shape what you believe around your identity, which I guess is probably always is obviously pretty scary, and it's hard to see how you put the pieces back together, and easy to feel. I mean, the temptations that I think every news organization feels to sort of tell people what they want to hear.
Right.
And I think right now there's kind of an opening for a sort of Glenn Beck of the left that I'm sure somebody will step into. And certainly, and meanwhile, Trump is just very effectively and actively, we had a great story by Charlie Warzel today about the way in which he's really helping to build this conservative media that we refer to, I don't know if anybody's seen the show Stranger Things, but like the Upside Down. Mm-hmm. It's like that.
Mm-hmm. That's what it feels like.
It's sort of this sort of dark, yeah, anyway.
But the public also holds the news business in quite low regard, similar to the way politics are. So is there like soul searching going on in the newsrooms and among reporters about their own role?
I think, yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there's a number. Again, I think a lot of these things, you always want there to be one cause of a thing. And if you ask a historian about the French Revolution, it's like, well, there were 19 causes, And I think any of these stories are pretty complicated. I think, when you see polling about the media and do you trust the media, I mean, who would say I trust the media? Like, what even is that?
Right.
Are Donald Trump's tweets the media or
right.
not? I think, and if you ask people, do you trust your local newspaper? People mostly say yes. Do you trust the thing you're consuming? People mostly say yes. And I think that's a little overstated in some ways, although obviously people hate and distrust what they see as the other side's media, which is it's a really problematic thing. But at the same time, you've seen this incredible revival of the Washington Post in particular, but also huge subscription numbers for the Times, people turning to CNN. I mean, these are like really good signs of people kind of appreciating. And I think there's more really amazing journalism being done now than at any time that I've ever paid attention to. I think from our perspective, I think there's an impulse, and a pretty legitimate one, in a lot of traditional media to say, come back to, like, if you look at these kind of new slogans these outlets have, democracy dies in the dark, like we've got to go back to the old way and to these trusted brands and sort of, and those guys are doing amazing work, but for us, I think as a brand where we're not going to say, BuzzFeed News has been here for 100 years and you should trust us because your grandfather read us. I think we think a lot about why should somebody trust us and and I think for us it's very much about essentially transparency and saying we're not actually asking you to trust us per se. We're showing you our work. We're going to show you the documents. We're going to link to. We're going to detail our reporting process. We're going to do it in public to the degree we can. If you tweet at us and yell at us about something, we will try to respond to you and explain what we're doing. And in general, we're not sort of asking you to take it on faith, and we're not pretending to kind of be a gatekeeper. We think that you should trust us because you understand who we are and what we're trying to do.
Well, it's interesting because in this space is also Facebook and Twitter and Google, YouTube, and that see themselves as platforms, not as content providers, and yet they are moving a lot of this content, and they ultimately do feel like content providers to a lot of consumers. Do you think they, are going to have to assume more accountability for this, kind of wild west fake news
I think at
environment?
various points in Facebook's history, different kinds of kind of growth hackers have figured out how to game it.
Right.
So there were curiosity gap headlines for a while. You won't believe what happens next, and that was essentially kind of spam. And Facebook eventually figured out its technical features in a way like people click through, but then they don't stay for long. And I think with fake news and this sort of kind of viral fake propaganda, Facebook is very good. I think you're already probably seeing a bit less of it in your timeline. We think it's spreading a bit less, although there's still a lot. And I think for them, obviously, there's sort of media and political pressure on them, and particularly in Europe, actually, to kind of not promote that stuff. But there's also, they're in the advertising business, and I think for marketers are being told, if you put your messages on Facebook, they'll be persuasive, and people will associate them with your brand. And Facebook can't say that and then also say, but don't worry about the political stuff. Like, nobody believes it, right? And so I think for Facebook, it's pretty important that they that they have some kind of sense of trust in the timeline.
Well, like you saw with the AT&T and Verizon and the advertisers walking away from YouTube
Yep.
last week over the
Yeah.
hate speech and stuff. So
No,
let's
but
go.
Yeah, but
go
all
ahead.
still, I mean, they're all the online sort of programmatic advertising ecosystem is this just strange black box. This
Right.
ecosystem in which you look at Zappos and these shoes follow you around for weeks.
But that's what funds fake
yeah,
news.
but
right?
they certainly, those shoes will show up on, like we had a story today as Gap ads showing up on these ridiculous fake news sites that there's just no way whoever bought those ads at Gap wants that. And I think that's sort of a crisis for those bits of the advertising industry.
Right, exactly. So let's go to some questions. We'll start with a few students. Are you a student? Uh-huh. Okay. And you may ask a question.
Does he not look studious
Yeah, no,
enough?
I can't.
Were you looking
my
at your
glasses
phone?
on.
Hi, I'm Ben Picker. I'm a third year in the college studying economics. My question is, do you think the way Donald Trump uses Twitter has changed how politicians need to use social media to reach the public? And if so, how do they need to change to be competitive in this political atmosphere?
I think it's always, good politicians have always been good at connecting with their voters in a way that feels immediate and authentic. I'm not sure Twitter is per se the medium for that. Like, I think that he likes Twitter and it kind of suits him. But I noticed recently that Cory Booker, who's probably of politicians, is sort of a little bit generational. Like, a lot of people kind of grew up on Twitter and Instagram and Snapchat, so it's not like you're going to be advised. Like, when you run for office, you're not going to need some staffer to tell you how to tweet. It's just a thing you grew up with. You might need a staffer to tell you how to talk to a camera that isn't a phone. Like, I think some of these things are just generational. But I noticed that Cory's moved over to Snapchat mostly. I think it's a little bit generational, but I'm not sure there's going to be some hard and fast rule. And I think Trump's a pretty unusual figure. He's a major, major celebrity. So I think the idea that, that's a roadmap for a candidate who is not a major national celebrity is, I don't know.
That's the anomaly question, you know?
Yeah, I just think it's hard to know.
Yeah.
I think you'll see lots of people imitate it, and some will work and some won't.
Yeah. My 21-year-old daughter just deleted Snapchat from her phone, by the way. So
Wow.
yeah, it's a new
Mark
frontier.
Zuckerberg is
Yeah.
pleased to hear that.
Yeah, exactly. Are you a student?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm a student.
Oh, go ahead.
It's pretty obvious the White House thinks that there's a liberal media bias directly against the executive branch, and a lot of the public believes him. So what's the media's response to that, to kind of like win back that portion of the public, convince the public that media actors really are neutral or really are in their best interest?
So it's a thing that I think about a lot. First of all, I wouldn't speculate on what the White House and what Trump actually think. They certainly are saying that, and they have a sort of political strategy to present the media as the opposition. I don't know whether or not that is an authentically, sincerely held view. I don't know. But I think that it's a bit of a trap, right? Like, I think that certainly there's an opportunity for somebody to say, yeah, we are the opposition, and I think that's a trap, and that's certainly what the administration would sort of like to create. But I think I can't speak for the media, and there's no such thing as the media from our perspective. It's about kind of not rising to that bait, trying to do our jobs, get stories right, and then I think ultimately you're not going to sort of rebuild or build people's trust in you around political stories.
Yeah.
Like, it's just such a toxic partisan universe, and the stories where we think we get a kind of deep engagement with our audience that isn't driven necessarily by that kind of confirmation bias or team spirit are often stories that are about this cop in Chicago today, stories about for-profit education companies that are screwing their students, or about a Berkeley professor who was sexually harassing students, which we wrote about last week, and is a huge story at Berkeley. And stories that really touch people's lives directly, and doesn't come into that context of, is this like fake or real? It's like a real, obviously true story that people in your world are responding to, and that's part of the reason we've invested. Most of our reporting isn't about politics. We invested very heavily in investigations, huge investigative series about the biggest chain of mental hospitals in the country, which is allegedly essentially institutionalizing people against their will, which, we heard from hundreds of patients and cops who'd been called and things like that. And it also, people give you tips that way. But so I think for us, a lot of that building of trust is not going to wind up happening around stories about Donald Trump, to be honest.
Yeah. Go ahead. Right, you're right here.
Hi. Years ago, I read an article by The Economist, The Foxification of News, and also recently, Ted Koppel criticized both Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity in front of them, saying that they polarize opinions. And I think that the social media create a perfect space for those so-called polarization entrepreneurs. So what do you see the legal or industrial level or even technical change that could ameliorate this situation? What kind of change that can prevent this constant pursuit of polarization?
I think that's a great question. I mean, I would note that Fox is not a social media company and has been around for a while. And so I think there's dating back to like the 40s, there was a radio host named Father Coughlin who did a lot of polarizing. I mean, the U.S. and broadly, the 20th century has a long tradition of very, very polarizing media voices and rallying people. But I also think you're right that it's that social media is a machine for it and can make things more polarized, more toxic. I mean, I think if there's a sliver of hope, I think consumers are getting more sophisticated. And this is an ecosystem that was really new to a lot of people this cycle. I mean, I do think that, as a lot of, you sort of see both people who are new to Facebook, say, whether it's, whether it's people your age or your older relatives or your kids, like when they are doing like weird stuff on the platform and saying things they shouldn't be saying and being really rude to each other. And then like you sort of figure out how the platform works and get more sophisticated. And I do think that at least some, I think it's pretty bad, it's pretty bad behavior in one of these ecosystems to share lies with people you know. And I definitely have seen people in my feed saying to their friends, hey, why did you share that? That's false. I can't believe you would share that with me. And I think having I think people are getting a bit more sophisticated about the media ecosystem. I think it's important that there's some kind of social cost for sharing things that are false. And I think there's a little bit more, and I think as people get more comfortable with and used to the ecosystem, I think that there will be some more of that, but I don't think there's any particular silver bullet.
Go ahead, sir.
Investigative reporters are talking about finding some smoking gun linking Trump to Russia. But what I'm perplexed about is how Trump is actually performing Putin's so-called Kremlin playbook. For example, Clint Watts, in his testimony before the Senate Intelligence Committee last week, rattled off a list of things like discredited institutions, trying to get marginalized NATO, creating confusion about whether there's the truth or not. Like the whole list is something that Trump simply performs almost all the time. So I'm just perplexed about how the public mind fails to say that we actually see Trump performing as Putin would want him to perform and doing what Putin would want him to do. So is this but is this a failure of you guys in the media to have some interpretive narrative so that people can see what's right in front of their noses?
I think that on one hand, the story of Russian interference in the election last summer, I think the media underplayed. That was a huge story. It was a huge story. And the idea that and I do think that, when you think about the Trump officials who, it's innocently or not, but maybe quite innocently, but then didn't think it was a good idea to talk about it, met with the Russian ambassador. But if you had met the Japanese ambassador in, early 1942, you wouldn't have not talked about Pearl Harbor. You probably would have come up. But they're like, we didn't talk about politics, we just talked about trade policy. Like, how would you not talk? I mean, I think there was a sense in which it was just underplayed. I think the media bears part of the responsibility for that, but the Obama administration also made a decision to downplay it effectively, to downplay this massive attack on the American political system. And when the President of the United States and his administration are saying, calm down, everyone, it's not that a big deal, that has a huge effect. In the post-election, I mean, I actually think that the notion that Trump is this sort of like Russian puppet is a very easy, is like you can put together, if you can pick a bunch of examples and point to it, but I think that's an overinterpretation. I think, in fact, he hasn't done the things that Russia wanted. In Russia, I think the sentiment is that they're the dog that caught the car.
Yes, sir.
Shayla,
Shayla.
I'm sorry. I'm not asking you for the content of any of your leaks or if you ever did or did not leak. I'm just wondering, at what point in time would you feel professionally comfortable in sharing the mechanics of leaking when you were in the White House? And Ben, did you take any solace from the fact that there's some exercise of taste in the media ecosystem that Trump's current marriage is virtually untouched as a topic? And if you'd rather go more philosophical, do either of you think that in your lifetimes the truth will out about this election?
You first.
I feel like the truth always comes out, and I think that's the general. I mean, it may not count as quickly as people would like, but I do think that ultimately the forces of truth, pushing for truth, prevail. In terms of leaks are a misunderstood tactic that people generally use. People in power use them to marginalize internal opposition, to push an idea that they have that they don't think is getting enough traction internally. It's usually like internal tactical reasons that compel people to leak. It's usually not a greater good in the interest of the president motivation. I had the advantage of having been a journalist and understood how manipulating the leak process can be. I also didn't feel like it served the president's interests to leak just in my own interests, and it wasn't. So I think what we're seeing now, leaks are usually an indication that there's like internal disarray and that people are competing against each other and are vying for access or influence over a particular decision. The Pentagon is probably the greatest leaking entity in Washington. That's because they're often, prosecuting their point of view in public in order to gain influence over the decision-making process. It's a totally legitimate tactic. It's just one that is not generally done in the best interest of the person that you're working for, or the president in my case. It's usually done to influence an outcome. So that's the best indication of how turbulent the White House is right now, is the fact that literally everyone who works there, including the president, is timing people
and the
out.
conflict between different arms of the government.
Exactly.
Too.
Yeah.
I think in terms of like the truth of the election coming out, I mean, I think like, the big stories that, Trump ran this demagogic campaign, that Russia intervened pretty aggressively on his behalf, these are not secrets that need to come out. This is like the story of the campaign. I do think, piece by piece, our story yesterday was a fairly big piece. What exactly each Trump advisor was doing in every day of the summer of 2016 is going to, that stuff will be reported. The FBI seems like they're going to get some of it under subpoena. But I think there's this, not to say that there is or isn't a smoking gun, some smoking gun of some massive surprise hidden in there, but I think you can't know that there is. And I do think there's a bit of a presumption of that there's some there that you just sort of don't know. And lots of great reporters are spending a lot of time trying to answer those questions, but we certainly don't sort of presuppose the answer. What was the last question? It was good too.
Melania.
Oh, Melania. Yeah, I think
Somewhere in the new media ecosystem.
I think she has opted out of the ceremonial office of the First Lady, basically, which I don't really know why that's part of the United States government.
Specifically asking about the marriage.
I don't, let's say, Donald Trump's marriages were like one of the most covered things in the New York media that I came up in. And I think if you went digging around the New York Post and the Daily News, you'd still find a fair amount of it. I do think, though, that there's a tradition that is a rare, kind of nice, mostly observed U.S. media tradition of not covering the president's kids that is observed and seems appropriate. They're underage kids. That was the one thing that the Obama White House would go really totally bananas about and threaten to pull access and say they'd never speak to you again. And if you, for instance, published a picture of 12-year-old Malia at a One Direction concert, like that was the craziest the White House ever went, in my experience. And they were very protective of that tradition, and I think the Trump people have been very protective of Barron, and that seems appropriate. Yeah, I do think that Melania has opted out of this strange thing of the office of the president's wife that has been this incredibly kind of traditionalist. Like I think Hillary Clinton tried to give it a kind of feminist edge and got obliterated, and Michelle came in, and I think having seen that experience said she'll be into fitness and sort of very traditional women's work in a certain way. And I guess I don't really understand why that office is part of the U.S. government, and it seems totally legitimate that Melania is not really doing that. And why would you cover her?
Yeah, I would add to that I think President Trump attracts so much heat that there's just almost not enough to go around to anyone else.
And he has other relatives who are very involved in the running of the government.
So it's like almost like an allocation of emotional energy. Yeah.
That said, any story that you have imagined will be written in the next. You know what I mean? Like,
exactly.
As you say it, of course there will be some giant story, but like
if she doesn't move to Washington
tomorrow, that story that you've said to him will be written somewhere. Like it just, I think inevitably, like I don't think there's. I think it's a combination of factors, but ultimately there probably will be some reporting on her at some point.
Well, there's a lot of
depending on what she does and what she says and what she's up to.
Well, and the cost of the apartment.
On the marriage.
Marriage.
I think if people
failed relationship.
Obviously, I mean, I think if you have sources, please come talk to me afterward.
Yes, ma'am. Oh.
Hi, thank you. The title today was hashtags and retweets, and I want to talk for a minute about how do you see the Trump administration using particular features of these platforms or content aggregators, depending on how we want to talk about them, from other politicians or from other celebrities or from the Obama administration. So even thinking about the ways in which he and his administration use POTUS and Real Donald Trump very differently, that among politicians he retweets very infrequently and uses very few hashtags. And so I'm wondering, what do you think that is and how does it compare?
So actually, I'm going to answer a slightly different question. I mean, I don't have a deep thought on that, but what I do think is that a lot of his supporters take social media and their mechanics like extremely seriously. And so, for instance, you may have noticed that if you were on Twitter yesterday or was it this morning, Susan Rice was trending. And it was not a huge story, but it was trending because Trump supporters know how the Twitter algorithm works and have a network of bots and got it trending because to trend, you need a certain number of retweets at certain hours of the day. It's easier to make something trend. And there's, you don't need that many people, but they're pretty smart, and there's a reasonable number of them who, in a focused, deliberate way, understood the mechanics of the platform and got that to trend. And that was sort of a medium-sized victory that helped push that story into the kind of mainstream media ecosystem. And I think, actually, we had a great story. A reporter was Ryan Broderick about how this is working in the French election and how French Le Pen supporters have sort of combined forces with Trump supporters on an app called Discord. Like this is some kind of William Gibson novel. It's a gaming app. It's sort of like a Slack for gamers. And they're translating they're basically giving people Le Pen memes and templated French language comments to spam the comment sections of French newspapers, which on one hand seems like not the most like productive use of your political time, the comment section of newspapers. But on the other hand, they take, like, there's a large group of people taking these things totally seriously that I think the Clinton campaign kind of laughed off as a secondary thing. And I think that is part of this ecosystem now, is that this new sort of kind of alt-right media in other right media, alt-right media, takes these sort of mechanics, really, these social media mechanics really seriously, are really thoughtful and focused on how to get incremental gains on all these platforms in a way that a lot of both the legacy media and Democratic campaigns are sort of complacent about.
Mm-hmm. We have time for a couple more questions. Go ahead.
Don't even know if I need this, but so I'm going to shift gears just a little bit on you, but obviously entering into a career in journalism today is very different than when you guys probably both did. And with just the huge number of responsibilities you have in digital and this and that, on top of like all the like investigative stories you might be working on, whatever, you have a lot on your plate. I guess just as someone who's like maybe interested in going into journalism, like, do you think that is is that good or bad for the institution of media?
You going into it, probably.
Well, okay.
Mixed feelings.
Great answer, thank you.
Based on this interaction.
Next. But like, is the institution of the media better off with journalists having to tweet however many times a day, or having to have all these extra responsibilities that social media has created for them?
We may have different views on this. I don't see them as responsibilities. Like, I think reporters want to talk to their audience and get information to people, and I am relieved to not have the responsibility to publish a daily newspaper, which, like, tweeting is a bit of work. Like, the New York Times is a giant factory in Queens, staffed with hundreds of people and robots, and then hundreds of drivers who, at 4 a.m, go and deliver like this incredibly created print newspaper to households all over the tri-state area. Like, that is a lot of work. Tweeting is like not so much work.
But
I don't, Shelley, did you want to?
I've never tweeted.
Never.
Partly why I left journalism.
Never tweeted.
But when you talk about tweeting and you talk about the social media, it's also become instamatic news. There's very little analysis, and you have to beat your competitor to be on top of it. How do we change that and go back to the period when, if somebody made a misstatement, as Robert Kennedy did in Indianapolis back in '68, there is time to talk to him and talk to his staff to get it correct?
I think for better and for worse, that all is going to happen in public now. But I don't think and I think that asks a lot in some ways of the audience, or at least it sort of requires people to get used to that. But it is also making transparent things that were happening behind the scenes before, in terms of, cleaning up somebody's remarks if they were inaccurate, and in some ways, allowing an interpretation to shape the reality. It definitely means we have less power in certain ways to shape what people consume. But on the other hand, I think, the context is so much more available, right? It used to be that the only context you'd get would be the analysis of the author of the article or of the television commentator, which could be totally wrong or skewed or biased in systematic ways. And so, for better and for worse, people choose their context more.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm wondering if you have thoughts on the role of humor in both journalism and social media. It's pretty clear that the president does not have a sense of humor, and that he really despises being ridiculed, which has sort of meant that late-night television, among other places, and journalism and social media has just exponentially increased the way it uses humor to explain the absurdities of this president, and even to the point of the news of I think it was the Washington Post article that was posted on 1600 Daily, which was supposed to be about how wonderful the administration was, and in fact, it was a total parody written by one of the opinion columnists.
I missed that one, but I mean, yeah, I don't have any deep thoughts on this, but obviously I do think and I wonder when the real exhaustion is going to hit with the sort of daily stories of White House aides knifing each other. And it does seem like humor, at some point, comedy is a pretty good way to is obviously a very powerful thing right now. Yeah.
It was an extremely effective tool for us in the White House, and the president and the vice president were both really good at it. And you also find some of the best general audiences through like late night comedy shows. All kinds of people watch Jay Leno, and it has a kind of a neutralizing effect that I think was very powerful for us. I mean, one of the few things we collaborated on with BuzzFeed was a humorous video by the president on that was about healthcare, about getting people to sign up for ACA. We found it a very effective way to convey policy.
And Obama had a kind of ironic detachment.
Yeah.
Like he has a kind of actually I think at some point sometimes made it difficult for him to connect. Like he sometimes wasn't able to he gave all these speeches that never quite hit, and I think like there were moments in his presidency where it didn't serve him well, that he's so cool. But it also made him kind of hard to mock. Like he was often in on the joke. I feel like Key and Peele eventually kind of got it, but there was not a good Saturday Night Live Obama. And Trump, because he has no detachment, is an incredibly easy target.
We've got 2 minutes. Anyone? Is that it? Okay.
Yeah, so you've pushed back on the idea that like journalists should be gatekeepers, and I'm thinking about the Trump-Russia dossier a little bit.
Yeah.
But and it seems like you guys don't really subscribe to like the same standards that the Associated Press would say you should use or the Washington Post uses. So I'm wondering if you can like talk about what BuzzFeed News standards are for like when you should and should not publish information, or if it's more just like a case-by-case decision.
Yeah, for sure. And the question was about this dossier of unverified claims about Donald Trump that we were the first to publish. I think that, this was a complicated, I think that there are two things going on. One is that I do think broadly see our role in the ecosystem as helping navigate people through a space which means debunking a lot of false things, verifying true things, sometimes talking about and touching information whose sort of truth status is uncertain. The dossier conversation is maybe a cousin of that because it obviously was not some claim that was widely circulated, although elements of it were. And we had it not for as long as I think a couple of publications had copies of it over the summer and before the election. We didn't, and so when we got it in December, our first instinct, as I think everybody's, was, well, there's a bunch of verifiable or falsifiable claims in here. Let's try to run them down. We had a reporter going door to door in Prague, showing hotels Michael Cohen's picture. I mean, a lot, stuff like that. But I think at some point, how long do you hold it, right? And the countervailing factor was, my phone is full of tips from people that contain, scurrilous claims about other people that, of course, I'm not publishing without verifying, but also which have no consequence other than that I saw the email. This is a document that was very much affecting people's conduct. Harry Reid had written an open letter referring to it. The president and the president-elect had been briefed on it. It was the sort of the substrate of a major FBI investigation of a huge tug of war between elements of the American government and dozens of, if not hundreds, of journalists, intelligence officials, politicians, John McCain. It was very much in play. And so we were having an internal conversation about whether at that point you should publish it. And I think, should that have been published before the election? And also the author was a credible person. These are all factors. Should it have been published before the election? Should it be published next year, in 100 years? At what point do you publish these things? I mean, it's sort of a reasonable question, and we were having that conversation. And then there was a television report that I think, from my perspective, really tipped the balance, which was, not only does this dossier exist and is it the subject of this tug of war, but here are the two main claims, that there's compromising information about Donald Trump and that the Russian government has, and that his aides have had secret, undisclosed contacts with Russian intelligence officials. At that point, I don't really understand the idea that you go out there, you say that you make these kind of sinister and shadowy claims, and you say, we've got them from a document that we've seen, but we're not going to let you see it. We think it might scald your eyes out. We can handle it, we professionals. And I think that middle ground is a place I don't really understand, and it seemed to us that the right thing to do there is to say, in fact, here's the document that others are reporting from. Here's what we know about it. Like, here's the source of the document. Here are some things, by the way, that were clear errors in it. Alpha Bank was misspelled, some other things. And that's the state of the reporting. We're still reporting. So that was sort of our view on that. I actually don't think we come from sort of I don't think we have profoundly different standards from the Post or CNN, and I think we mostly on most cases, will come to the same conclusion on whether or not to publish a story. I do think we come from a different point of departure, though, which is that if you do sort of think of yourself as the gatekeeper, in a way, the question you're asking is, why should we publish this? And I think for us, there's a bit of a question of why shouldn't we? Why should our readers not see this? And in this case, there didn't seem to be a reason so compelling that it would mean continuing to conceal it.
It's a fascinating insight, not only into a story that continues to emerge, but also the way newsrooms and involving media landscape are thinking about these really important questions. And I want to just thank you, Ben Smith, and Shayla Murray, very much for this conversation, and thank all of you for your great questions. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. And join me in giving them a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you.